Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panayi, and today's podcast has been inspired by an essay I wrote called In the Shadow of Gods on Human Frailty and Self-Doubt, and it is taken from my book Alchemists of Suburbia. And the essay was inspired by some thinking that I was going through, some reflections on the human species and how it differs to other species. I was watching some documentaries on sea turtles, and it struck me how the sea turtle, when it hatches from its egg, it just goes towards the ocean and in it goes. It's totally independent. It doesn't have its parent to look after it at all. From the get-go, the sea turtle is on its own, looking after itself. And there are several other species that likewise fend for themselves right from the get-go, from the moment of hatching. Well, you couldn't get further from that than the human species. As soon as we are born, we can do nothing for ourselves. We can breathe for ourselves, but, not much else. We can't sit up. We can't crawl. Our motor skills are not developed yet. We can't feed ourselves. We can't look for food. We are incredibly vulnerable. Of all the species on the planet, we are the most vulnerable species when we are born. We are hugely dependent on adults of our species generally to provide for us, to keep us safe and to nurture us for a long time until we are capable of looking after ourselves. Now, this struck me as interesting. If we think of our lives as having been chosen in the Course in Miracles, we look at how the script is written and we choose what script or what kind of movie or tale, journey of the self, that we are going to review. What story are we going to review? Well, if we come in to human form, how is that different to, let's say, we decide to review a lifetime where perhaps it is possible that we were an animal? I really don't know the exact answer to those things. If you are in the Buddhist tradition or other spiritual traditions, there is the acceptance of the idea that you can be born or have an incarnation as another species. Now, I'm not saying yes or no to that. I'm just saying, what is it about the human species, a human incarnation? What are the kind of classrooms or the learning situation that is unique or perhaps central, highlighted in the human existence? And I would suggest that it is that parent or adult dependency on an adult to help us survive in our early years. That is a big part of the human experience. Around the time that I was looking at this difference in terms of species development, I was also doing a course on Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory. And I found it very interesting how he talked a lot about how the human species, in contrast to others, begins to develop a self-image and see itself as an object. And I thought, wow, that's also very interesting in comparison to other species, that we begin to see ourselves, we begin to objectify ourselves in a way that it seems other species don't do. And then I wrote this essay called In the Shadow of Gods, based on Jacques Lacan's theory about what that kind of objectification does. And basically it causes us to have a particular relationship to authorities, to older people, to those that care for us, that makes us feel like we are in their shadow. We are a trifling, weak, small creature in comparison to those adults. That is a big part of the human experience. And I'm going to read out the entirety of the essay so you get the full flavour of the connections I was making between the differences in species in terms of dependency, but also in terms of the self-image and how all of that can be connected to our study of A Course in Miracles and that emphasis on the authority problem and how we perceive ourselves in relation to God. That is such an emphasis in the Course, but it's also an emphasis for the human species. Perhaps, again, we don't know the ultimate answers. I can't say ultimately that isn't kind of at the forefront of the experience of a sea turtle. I don't know. But it's an interesting surmising of the whole thing and helps to really bring into relief, to stark relief, the human experience and what we are dealing with in terms of an authority problem and objectifying ourselves, starting to see ourselves as an object. So the essay will help flush all of this out. And at the end of the essay, I'm going to refer to some passages in A Course in Miracles which link up to the essay, the idea of objectification and how to transcend that, and what that actually means, and also to forgiveness lessons, particularly in relation to parents, particularly those who may have been larger than life and for whom you always felt in their shadow. So let's begin with reading part 1 of my essay In the Shadow of Gods on Human Frailty and Self-Doubt. I recently read How to Be Invisible, a book of lyrics by Kate Bush. Reading David Mitchell's foreword, I came across the answer to a question I had harboured for many years. What was the inspiration for the music video to Cloud Busting? The video features Kate, short-haired and wearing overalls, helping a towering older man, Canadian actor Donald Sutherland, wield a large, strange contraption up a hill in the countryside. You soon figure out the machine is a cloudbuster for bringing on rain. The drama kicks in as several men dressed in black drive towards the mountain, later apprehending Sutherland and taking him away in their car. Kate runs wide-eyed and desperate down the hill towards them, tumbling and scrambling on the way. This video is moving for its portrayal of childhood devotion. The song Cloud Busting is based on the memoir A Book of Dreams, written by Peter Reich, the son of psychoanalyst and inventor William Reich. I was familiar with the father, but not the son, and that in itself speaks to the heart of the memoir. William Reich had a strong personality and made a name for himself with the publication of his book Character Analysis in 1933. Reich emphasised the effects of emotional conflicts and trauma on the musculature of the body. We develop muscular armouring, in his words, in response to our conflicts, and undoing the armouring through therapeutic breathing exercises can free us of these conflicts. There's little controversy around Reich's theory of character types and associated musculature armouring. Many therapies today incorporate it. Later in life, however, Reich went on to develop a theory of life energy based on sexuality and invented an orgone accumulator, a metal box in which you could sit and absorb orgone energy, which Reich claimed cured all sorts of physical ailments. Reich sold these boxes, placing him in conflict with the American Food and Drug Administration, which led to his arrest and imprisonment. Reich was consumed with the idea of energy, energy within the body, energy in the atmosphere, energy anywhere and everywhere. Convinced that aliens were directing invisible energy attacks toward Earth from UFOs, he invented a space gun to neutralise the attacks. And as Kate Bush's video depicts, Reich also claimed to be able to make rain using his cloud-busting machine, which propelled cloud-dispersing energy into the sky. In all of these pursuits, Reich's young son Peter was his loyal, adoring soldier-at-arms, soaking up everything his father said as the truth about things, and admiring Wilhelm's loyal following of maverick scientists. For 13 years, until his father died, Pete was a cosmic engineer, a lieutenant in his dad's army, ready to do battle to defend the work of his father and promote the truth. Toward the end of Peter's memoir, there's a reckoning with his past. He realises that his father's obsession had left his own needs, his own self, on the sidelines. Everything revolved around his father's work and talent. Peter's mother was also a scientist and worked alongside Wilhelm, but she too felt the effects of Reich's obsession. Everyone was subsumed by Reich's projects. She eventually left. Later, as an adult, the effects of his father's dominance hit home. One night, Peter met a woman in a bar. On the cusp of becoming intimate with him, she paused, explaining her hesitation by saying she didn't yet know who he was. His reaction betrayed a life in his father's shadow. "I'm Wilhelm Reich's son," he said, without thinking. And as soon as he said it, he knew he was wrong. Quote, "I felt the scream rising within me, a scream that left me spinning and falling alone, lost in space." End of quote. Moving from an identity as Wilhelm Reich's son to being himself involved Peter acknowledging his father's limitations. His father wasn't a god. He loved his son, but he also had failings. Like all of us, Wilhelm Reich was a mixed bag. As an adult, Peter was able to look at his father through different eyes. However, he was torn by a sense of loyalty to him. Peter had shifted in his view of Wilhelm as the ultimate authority. When, for example, Reich told his son that people were out to get him, that if he went to prison he would be killed, 13-year-old Peter believed him. However, when his father died whilst incarcerated, Peter wondered if the true cause of death was really heart failure, as officially reported. It's evident from Peter's memoir that his father had for a long time suffered from a chronic heart condition, but Wilhelm never disclosed this to Peter, instead perpetuating the idea that he'd die in prison at the hands of people who knew of the importance of his work and were afraid of it. As an adult, Peter wondered if it would be unfaithful to his father to no longer believe his conspiracy theories. Loyalty demanded that he retain the child's perspective of things if his father was to remain a god. The choice seemed to be between seeing his father as a god or as a charlatan. But he was neither. He was simply human. Peter's story puts the parent as God scenario into stark relief. Our stories mightn't be as clear-cut or dramatic, but all of us first make our parents into objects of worship, losing something of ourselves in the process. Later, we need to come to terms with their humanity. The giving up of the mythological, godlike images of our parents is, however, resisted well into adulthood. We harbour a hope that they can give us something that we desperately need. What that something is, and why we feel we need it, is the subject of the following discussion. We begin by looking at how the ego's world has been set up for the creation of demigods, and how the principles of A Course in Miracles can help us put things into perspective, promoting healing. So now we come to a subtitle called Half-Baked, Our Humble Beginnings. Compared to birds and mammals, newborn reptiles are particularly independent creatures. Take a sea turtle, for example. The pregnant female crawls out of the surf and up the beach till she reaches above the high water mark. There she digs a hole in the sand with her flippers, into which she lays her eggs, then covers them with sand. With this last act of maternal care, her job is done and she heads back into the water, resuming her life. When the turtles hatch, they make their own way towards the shore, enter the water and paddle out to sea. Their independent life begins. It's pretty impressive when you come to think about it. Newly formed and emerging into the world, the baby sea turtle has a nervous system developed enough for it to sense where the water is, they are guided by the moonlight reflecting on the ocean, and to coordinate their limbs right off the bat in order to take them there. They can hunt for themselves, eat what they need, and take shelter in seaweed floats, their nursery for a time. In contrast, warm-blooded newborns generally require more care. Birds and mammals commonly show intensive parental care of their young, who need time to develop skills for independent living. In relation to body size, birds and mammals have bigger brains than reptiles, and there's a definite link between social connections within a species and brain size. The larger the brain of the species, the greater the degree of parental care required by newborns. Like humans, chimpanzees form complex social groups. Their brains are large in respect to their body size, and newborns rely on caregivers for an extended period. But, in comparison, human infants are especially helpless because their brains are relatively underdeveloped. According to some estimates, the human gestation period would need to be around 21 months for a newborn to be at comparable neurological and cognitive developmental stage to that of a chimpanzee newborn. The main reason that humans are born in this less developed state is that the fetus's metabolic demands can't be met by the mother through placental nutrition after 9 months. So we are born extremely vulnerable and dependent. We don't have coordinated control of our limbs. We can't propel ourselves from A to B. We can't feed ourselves. It's a mistake, however, to think of helpless human babies as an evolutionary negative. Being born before the brain is set allows us to learn from experience. We have an extended period of neural plasticity outside the womb, which means we are teachable to a greater degree. So, just interjecting here, we are very teachable by our environment and the people, the adults, and whatever we encounter outside the womb, because we are born with such neuroplasticity in the brain. The brain is so underdeveloped that it is very malleable, which is what the plasticity means. Carrying on, our longer childhood allows us to assimilate complex culture, language, music, dance, social mores, along with fine motor skills for performing dexterous work. Indeed, we are able to wire our brains well into our 20s. Human cognitive abilities have also enabled us to mitigate physical risks through numerous inventions. We are the only species to be able to make fire, for example, which provides warmth, protects us from predators, enables us to cook food, and is useful for a host of other things. We've domesticated dogs so we can use them for hunting and protection. And of course, we're very good at developing weaponry. And here lies a paradox. Though humans are adapted for forming complex social bonds and inventing means for promoting their survival, they are exceptional for routinely killing their own species. Humans are, I'm afraid, a particularly murderous group. Other animals, such as chimpanzees, can attack their own kind in revenge as a deterrent to others or to maintain their position in the social hierarchy. But humans really take the cake when it comes to killing in revenge. Humans can also spread their revenge far and wide, to include the children or loved ones of an enemy, for example, or to wreak havoc and cruelty on an entirely innocent population not directly related to the original object of revenge. Also, in contrast to humans, revenge occurs shortly after an attack or social transgression with other animals. They don't spend an extended period of time plotting against enemies. For all intents and purposes, the human revenge reaction is way over the top, and as we'll see in part 2, this can also be linked to the extreme dependency we experience in infancy, along with our species' unique cognitive abilities. So before we go on to part 2, we see the double-edged sword here of having that plasticity when we are born. We are able to learn complex things like language and music. And if you've ever watched a pianist play a complicated piece. Like yesterday, I was watching someone play the Hungarian Rhapsody. If you check that out towards the end of that piece, the complexity is amazing. That anybody can play that, I think, is fantastic. It highlights the intricate motor skills and the memory and the learning that humans are capable of because they are born so helpless, because their brain is born so underdeveloped. They can learn a lot from their environment, but because that learning also involves learning a lot more intricate and detailed and nuanced social mores, social connections, that is the double-edged sword. We notice so much. Our social connections are so complicated. We have the most complicated social connections of any species that we also can become hypersensitive about ourself and our self-image and our place in the world. If you look at a human infant, just look at the absolute extremes, the human infant and how much they need those relationships, and the sea turtle and how it doesn't to survive. Those human relationships are going to form a huge part of that infant's inner experience of themselves. Anyway, let's go on to part 2. The French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan was particularly concerned with the emotional and psychological implications of our early physical helplessness and dependency. He was also interested in the human capacity for developing and understanding complex language. It is this capacity, along with our early dependency, that Lacan places at the centre of his psychoanalytic theory. For Lacan, human psychology and psychopathology are intimately related to our unique status as speaking beings. With social bonds comes language, and while other animals communicate, they don't show anything approaching the sophisticated grammar of human language. Humans might start out uncoordinated and helpless, but we become adept at language very quickly, picking up grammatical rules without instruction. Because of this ability, the linguist Noam Chomsky proposed that a language acquisition device exists in the brain, giving us a natural propensity to learn language. In other words, our capacity to absorb the complexities of human language may be hardwired in the brain. Now we come to a subtitle, Image Makers. The acquisition of language is no small feat. Apart from the obvious implications around communication, it also contributes to the human infant developing a self-image, a self-consciousness, in the recognition of itself as a subject of language. For Lacan, the infant's sense of I first comes to the fore when he or she can recognise their own reflection. He calls this the mirror stage of development. Humans are one of only a few species that can recognise themselves in a reflection. However, Lacan noticed that while the chimpanzee infant, our closest cousin, can recognise its reflection earlier than can a human infant, the chimp soon tires of its image, whereas the human is fascinated by theirs. The human infant moves an arm and watches its reflection do the same. It smiles and laughs, and so does the face in the mirror. Amazing. We recognise ourselves in the mirror and hear our parents' words attached to the image, reasoning, "That's Sue, that's me." We've heard the name before, but now we attach it to an image. We now see ourselves as an object, the object in the mirror, and shortly after begin to attribute traits and characteristics to this me. Thus begins a split between the seer and the seen, the subject and the object. Indeed, when a child learns to speak, they often refer to themselves objectively in the third person. Sue thirsty, Sue's toy. Children build on their image as they acquire language, and they are particularly sensitive to their own name and what is said around it. Everything they hear becomes incorporated into their image. They are the subject of all the narratives around them. For Lacan, this elaborate objectification of the self is the essence of the human world. So I'll go back to this sentence. Thus begins the split between the seer and the seen, the subject and the object. So when we start to recognise ourselves in the mirror as a very small child or infant, and then start to recognise our name and learn when people are using that name that they're talking about us, we start to have an experience of the seer. So I am a subject, I am a seer, but I'm also an object. I'm also the object of other people's conversations. Okay, carrying on. We have to wonder at the fascination of the human infant compared to the chimpanzee, for example, in recognising their reflection. This, said Lacan, was a factor of our greater vulnerability and less developed state. Inside, the human infant feels a chaotic churning of fragmented thoughts and emotions, but their image in the mirror suggests that they are a whole, stable being. The human infant identifies itself as an ideal whole I in the mirror, and thus begins a fascination with the idea of wholeness. They become drawn to images of apparent wholeness because of the fragmentation they feel within, and thus begins a lifelong process of unconsciously modelling our image on the images of wholeness around us. We make demigods of the stronger, more powerful, seemingly more complete people we see, and for infants, these gods are our parents or primary carers, the big, powerful people they rely on for survival. We play parent with our toys as soon as we're able. The life of adults fascinates us, and we yearn to be part of it, to have access to its magic. Later, we mimic sporting heroes and other invulnerable giants. But no matter who we model ourselves on, we remain acutely aware of our developmental limitations, and we feel insignificant, inferior, because of them. We are small beings in the face of greatness. If a God approves of us, we feel whole. If they don't, we become anxious. We can act out in defiance or become submissive through defeat. Either way, the powerful figure becomes the centre of our universe, and we orbit around them, forgetting our true self in the process. Our I becomes a precarious thing, built on comparisons with the personalities around us, subsumed within their world. And while we long for approval from our gods, we also wish we had what they had, the power, the glory, the wholeness. We become envious of them and wish for the recognition they receive by virtue of being master. Perhaps that is the appeal of superheroes, to be able to leap tall buildings in a single bound, to fly unaided through the sky, to block bullets with bare hands. The superhero is our alter ego, the expression of our longing to be without our vulnerability. Likewise, the appeal of cult leaders and dictators often lies in their seemingly impenetrable self-confidence and absolute narcissism. They appear to be so sure of themselves. The German philosopher Hegel proposed that the fundamental human need is for recognition. The problem is that we carry our sense of infantile vulnerability well into adulthood. We suffer from the fear of not being good enough, and it's this fear that makes the human species exceptional at killing its own kind. In my book, Above the Battleground, The Courageous Path to Emotional Autonomy and Inner Peace, I refer to the work of Dr. Joseph Satin, a veteran in the field of forensic psychiatry. In his paper, Murder Without Apparent Motive, Satin examined men convicted of seemingly unmotivated murders and found that the men had become triggered when they felt rejected by the victim. The men themselves couldn't understand why they killed these strangers, but all had been concerned about being considered sissy or physically undersized when young, having suffered significant deprivation and cruelty. Their unconscious rage was ignited when the victim-to-be unwittingly triggered the sense of humiliation first experienced at the hands of people more powerful than them. Extreme examples help shed light on psychological processes within all of us. While our past experiences might differ in intensity, the link between feeling inferior and an impulse to retaliate isn't unique to a childhood characterised by significant trauma. Lacan's point is that we all start out with shame anxiety, an inferiority complex, by virtue of being human. While other animals might kill to maintain social order, humans have a propensity for killing out of narcissistic fury. The pain of feeling less than others, not worthy of recognition, can lead to a brutal response. In Hegel's philosophy, our desire for recognition leads us to attack others in an attempt to prove our power and dominance. We use the way of animals to achieve respect and recognition. "I'll show you" is the underlying statement. But on another level, our attack is a defense to the painful recognition of our emotional vulnerability and dependency. "I'm not weak" is what we're trying to show ourselves. The pain associated with our self-conscious I might be why some adults continue to talk about themselves in the third person. It often sounds infantile or grandiose when people speak of themselves this way. For example, Bob might say, "Nobody messes with Bob." Perhaps for some people, the subjective inner world expressed by I is far too painful to venture into, and talking about themselves in the third person helps to create some distance from it. Third-person speech is particularly noticeable in sports people or others in highly competitive fields. The basketballer LeBron James, for example, announced his decision to join the Miami Heat with the following explanation, quote, "I wanted to do what was best, for LeBron James, and what LeBron James was going to do and make him happy," end of quote. Clearly, our early dependency, along with the ability to recognise our reflection and our enhanced capacity for language, have significant drawbacks. Objectifying ourselves leads to intense self-evaluation, and our heightened self-consciousness becomes linked to feelings of vulnerability, inadequacy, and unworthiness. But the situation isn't all bad. This very same self-consciousness can be our ticket to inner peace. In the Buddhist tradition, being born into the animal realm means to be driven by impulse and instinct. In contrast, humans have the ability to consider our perceptions, to question assumptions and elaborate and reflect upon abstract ideas such as spirit, God, and the existential favourite, "Why am I here?" In other words, with the ability to develop a supremely self-conscious I, also comes the ability to move beyond I, me, and mine. But now we come to the final section of the essays, and it's called Awakening from the Dream. According to A Course in Miracles, all of our distress comes from guilt. The Course uses the word guilt to encompass both shame and guilt. As such, our distress comes from believing we are bad and inferior. These exquisitely self-conscious feelings come from a belief that we have attacked God by turning our back on His oneness, and that we have become a mere shadow of our whole and holy selves. The first half of life is where we experience a basic retelling of our imagined conflict with God. There's a struggle for autonomy and independence, feelings of weakness and inferiority compared to our parents' omnipotence, wanting to be chosen but forever feeling neglected. It's all there, along with the fear of abandonment and retribution. The first half of life is a biblical tale. In the Course's mythology, the belief in our separation from God was the beginning of all self-doubt. We identified with shame, guilt, and vulnerability and experienced an acute sense of loss for the love left behind. We felt a void where before we experienced wholeness, and thus began a lifelong search for completion and approval from our various idols. But this search is itself a testament to our neediness, to our weakness and vulnerability, and we become touchy, defensive creatures. This is a quote from the Course. Only uncertainty can be defensive, and all uncertainty is doubt about yourself. Practicing forgiveness is the way to stop our defensiveness, but because we're very attached to the devil we know, our self-made image, it takes time before we stop looking to the world to placate our vulnerability. We still form special relationships with people and projects in the hope that they will affirm our value, thereby making us feel better. Meanwhile, our true self, both in the sense of our authentic personality and spiritual self, is lost in the stories associated with our demigods, the centre of our childhood universe, later to be projected onto all our major relationships. It takes time and practice to trust that forgiveness really does give us everything we want. Practicing forgiveness is how we avail ourselves of a sense of confidence, stability, and peace, enabling us to release our demigods from the burden of having to be everything for us. Yet we often prefer our sense of vulnerability, weakness, shame and guilt, because these things maintain our separate, self-made ego identity. It might be a shabby identity associated with a great deal of pain, but it's ours. We made it. Choosing the weakness of our ego identity over the strength of wholeness reflects our desire to be the author of ourselves, our own authority. Every idol is a substitute for God, a way of excluding His love. We turn to a special partner, a special project, or a special battle to provide us with reassurance instead. We try to manage our fears by controlling outer circumstances and people rather than asking for help to see things differently through the eyes of peace rather than judgment. By turning to our idols, we remain in charge, weak, vulnerable, but in charge. This is why the Course says that love waits on welcome, not on time. We gradually let go of our idols, along with our investment in feeling weak and dependent, as we learn through practicing forgiveness that we are better off choosing the second place to gain the first, as it says in the Course. We are much happier without our emotional angst and inner turmoil, happier without a battle to fight, a war to wage, a conflict to feel victimised by or triumphant within, even though that means accepting that we are part of God's creation, not an autonomous self-made ego. Here's a quote from the Course. It is obvious that any situation that causes you concern is associated with feelings of inadequacy, for otherwise you would believe that you could deal with the situation successfully. It is not by trusting yourself that you will gain confidence, but the strength of God in you is successful in all things. When we choose to be dependent only on God, which is expressed by practicing forgiveness, we realise our demigods are just like us, that they share the same fears and needs. We can then be confident to step into our own shoes, once seemingly usurped by our self-appointed idols, because we're aware that the strength of God, of wholeness, travels with us. And that is the end of the essay. So as we've seen throughout this essay, the main point is that as humans, we objectify ourselves very quickly from birth onwards. We experience ourselves as the object other people talk about, that other people relate to. We become exquisitely self-conscious amongst our environment and the many varied and complex social networks in which we are embedded. All of this influences the development of our self-concept. And we do feel objectified. we feel like an object within the world of others. And that ultimately is because we identify with the body. It is the body that people see. It is the body that people talk to. It is the body that people talk about until we reach maturity and seek another way of perceiving things and go down a spiritual path. We are so strongly identified with the body. And so we will always feel an object within the world of others. In contrast, the Course talks about us being an idea, that we are ideas. We are an idea within the mind of God. And it reminds us that ideas do not leave their source. So we are still within the mind of God. And it also says that God is an idea. So I'd like to read out a couple of paragraphs from chapter 15, section 6, called The Holy Instant and the Laws of God. So I'm reading out paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. All separation vanishes as holiness is shared, for holiness is power, and by sharing it, it gains in strength. So with our experience of extreme dependency as infants and children, we have the contrast here being that holiness is power. Holiness is shared. And we are all equal in holiness. There is no comparison of the powerful and the weak. The truly powerful is holiness, and we all share in that equally. So tapping in or getting into contact with our holiness is how we rise above that perception of being an object and being vulnerable. Carrying on. If you seek for satisfaction in gratifying your needs as you perceive them, you must believe that strength comes from another, and what you gain he loses. Someone must always lose if you perceive yourself as weak, yet there is another interpretation of relationships that transcends the concept of loss of power completely. You do not find it difficult to believe that when another calls God for love, your call remains as strong. Nor do you think that when God answers him, your hope of answer is diminished. On the contrary, you are more inclined to regard his success as witness to the possibility of yours. That is because you recognize, however dimly, that God is an idea, and so your faith in him is strengthened by sharing. What you find difficult to accept is the fact that, like your Father, you are an idea, and like him, you can give yourself completely, wholly without loss, and only with gain. Herein lies peace, for here there is no conflict. So if we feel weak and vulnerable, having identified with the body and as an object within the world through which others might want to get something or attack, we can't feel generous, have a generosity of spirit towards anybody, because in the ego's eyes, whatever we give as bodies, we no longer have. And so if we're already perceiving ourselves as weak and vulnerable, we can't afford to give anything. We can't afford to feel any weaker or more vulnerable than we already do. And so that is why the ego is like a getting mechanism. It always just seeks to get. And so we might give, but we give to get. In contrast, if we identify with our holiness, with being an idea within the mind of God, we are an idea that is beyond the body. It has no connection to the body. Basically, through forgiveness is how we keep tapping in to the idea that we are an idea at one within the idea of God. And that is how we tap into our holiness. And then we share that idea of holiness with others, that they are also an idea within the mind of God. And by sharing that idea on the level of mind, we strengthen it. And this brings me to another section of the course, which is in chapter 14. The chapter is called Teaching for Truth. And the section I'm going to read is a couple of paragraphs from the section, The Conditions of Learning. If you are blessed and do not know it, you need to learn it must be so. The knowledge is not taught, but its conditions must be acquired, for it is they that have been thrown away. You can learn to bless and cannot give what you have not. If, then, you offer blessing, it must have come first to yourself, and you must also have accepted it as yours, for how else could you give it away? That is why miracles offer you the testimony that you are blessed. If what you offer is complete forgiveness, you must have let guilt go, accepting the atonement for yourself and learning you are guiltless. How could you learn what has been done for you, unknown to you, unless you do what you would have to do if it had been done for you? Indirect proof of truth is needed in a world made of denial and without direction. Okay, so indirect proof of truth that it's talking about is if you offer holiness, forgiveness, innocence, the idea of innocence to somebody else, you must have forgiven yourself. So I'd like to give a tangible example of this, and it relates well to this idea of being in the shadow of God's, of the big forgiveness lessons we have in relation to our parents or other figures that we always felt diminished by, or that their needs always seemed to take precedence to our own, and we felt neglected in the process. I recently read about a retired Australian footballer who was very famous, and he played in the major leagues and was extremely good. He was the son of another Australian footballer who also was very famous and played at the highest level and was very successful in the Hall of Fame of football and all that kind of thing. Well, the senior figure was also involved in drugs, in selling drugs, in taking drugs. And I think it's fair to say that he was a bit neglectful with his children. He has a daughter and a son, the son who went on to play football. Now, what I read recently was that the son, who has now retired from football, he's married and he had a child, another son. And recently they realised that the child has a disorder which requires a lot of attention, and his child will never be able to play football. What I thought was interesting was that now the footballer was going to need to focus on his son and giving the attention, care, nurturing that his father never provided for him. And that by being able to do that for his son, for his disabled son, I thought it was a wonderful symbol of being able to show that he had forgiven his neglectful father for what he hadn't given him, because now he can provide that for his son. So generally we say you can't give something to somebody or do something for someone unless somebody has taught you how to do it, or something to that effect. But being able to provide this for his son, even though his father hadn't been able to provide it for him, it was a way of forgiving his father, because it's like saying no harm done. You didn't provide this for me, but there has been no harm done. There's no blame, because I can still provide this for my son. So it shows that I have not been affected. I have not been harmed in that way by your lack of nurture. I am able to nurture my son. And to be able to give the nurture that you weren't given is to tap into that sense of holiness, that sense that you are an idea, to rise above the battleground, to rise above the objectification of yourself as a body. The whole forgiveness process allows you to rise above the body that got things or didn't get things. Often when we haven't received the nurturing that is ideal in the world's eyes when we're a child, we feel a real sense of grief, of needs unfulfilled. And Freud wrote a paper called Mourning and Melancholia, where he said that it was curious when someone died that the people left behind would mourn. There's a natural process of mourning, and then eventually you can come out of it. But he said some people, it just continues and it starts to get into melancholia or depression. And he said the difference is between the normal mourning and the melancholia linked to the mourning is that the melancholia involves an intense self-recrimination, really putting yourself down. And he linked this also to having some grievances, some unresolved grievances associated with the deceased. Now, Carl Jung said that at the bottom of every depression is a task that will lead to a new direction. A task will be presented through which we can forgive. We can experience forgiveness towards the deceased. Or they could be still living and we're still going through the depression associated with needs unmet. Anyway, a task will be presented through which we can forgive that person for needs unmet. And how do we forgive that person for needs unmet? We give to others, or we express something that wasn't given to us. But we don't do it consciously, right? You didn't do this for me. I'm going to make sure I do this for other people. It's not like that. A situation is presented to us where we don't have a choice, really. We need to step up. It's kind of like that. We need to step up and provide something that wasn't provided for us. And that is how we recognize that there was no damage done. That is how we recognize that we have what we thought we didn't have because of our past experience. We have the capacity to nurture, even though we weren't nurtured. We have the capacity to give love, to give support, to help someone through a sickness, even though we weren't given that. And the way we rise to the task, and it's always a challenging task, these big shifts, especially out of a deep melancholia or depression, the task is usually big. It's scary. It makes us think we can't do it. But the whole point is that we can do it. We just don't realize it. It's like what the Course was saying. How could you learn what has been done for you, unknown to you, unless you do what you would have to do if it had been done for you? How do you know the Holy Spirit is with you? How do you know the Holy Spirit has given you His strength, has given you His love, and that you are forgiven, you are holy, and that you have the power of being an idea within the mind of God? How do you know all this has been given to you unless you do what you would naturally do if it had been given you? So that is the silver lining. That is the purpose and meaning associated with these big tasks. And they help us forgive that demigod for not providing what we feel we should have got. And that is how we are released from that melancholia. And then that energy that was being soaked up, attached to the melancholia, to the grief associated with both our resentment towards that person, but also our love, all the grief associated with that, the energy associated with that holding pattern is now free to be invested in now, out from the past and into now. And that is the rebirth that a process like this promises. That brings us to the end of this podcast. I hope you found it helpful and tune in again. Thank you. Bye.